Good evening. It is such a pleasure to be with you all. I have to admit, I will say up front that Zoom is not my natural environment. So I would love to be with you all in person at some point, should that prove to be possible. But it is, in the meantime, great to be with you. This has been such a good project to be involved in, and it's really nice to see some faces and actually be able to talk to other people about it. Just to say a little bit about myself by way of introduction, I'm a freelance social researcher, but also involved in my own church and community work down here in Sussex. So it's really bringing together my research background. I recently completed an MA in theology for mission and ministry, and it's putting those two things together, I think, which was why Ian asked me whether I might get involved with helping you out with this project. So, as I think you know, the aim of the project was to start to listen to a bit more about, particularly to those who aren't part currently of the worshipping community. Listening is a really good thing to do at any stage of a church project, but particularly when you're thinking about change and about things being new, with having kind of Ian just having started. The idea was really to set up some semi-formal research so that we could just listen a bit more intentionally to people, so that we're not imposing preconceived ideas or anything, that we're actually listening and open to what people have got to say. And the aim was to bring a greater understanding of the local context. We all have our own individual understandings of what it's like to live somewhere, to work there, to visit there. But sometimes it's quite interesting to actually bring those different views together and to listen intentionally to them. And in particular, to listen to people who might not normally make it through your church doors. I would want to say that the way I'd normally do this kind of work is in a team. So I'd have wanted to be working with people. That wasn't possible at this stage, but I'd really encourage you to see this not as a finished piece of work, but as the beginning. This is just a tiny, small start of all sorts of things that you've already got going on and developing new things into the future. It's just a couple of things there. Theologically, I'd encourage you to think about being open to interruption. We've got a God who is both likely to interrupt us and open to interruption, possibly. So part of the background to this is just being open to listening to what God might be saying in church through his word, but also through people outside. And where I come from a research perspective is, and those of you with more of a kind of management background, is this idea of generative listening. That if you really listen carefully, you can create new possibilities. So you're not listening just to hear things that you know already. You're not listening so that you get your opportunity to talk. But what happens with, I believe, with kind of some careful research is you can actually create new possibilities for action, and maybe things that nobody had actually thought of before. And certainly I think that was my experience in holding these conversations, was that sense of coming to kind of new understandings with people. So what I'm sharing with you tonight is based on 9 conversations that I had, it seems like a long time ago, back in January, February time, and an online group discussion. And I've also put that, if you've had the opportunity to see the full report, I've put that into the context of the kind of available neighbourhood statistics. So you've got some of those numbers, some of the maps, but most importantly, the real detail of what people were saying, kind of in deep conversation. Very brief overview of what we're going to be talking about tonight. Divided kind of the findings into 4 main areas. What your context, what your local area looks like, and you'll be aware that it's a very diverse and mixed area, and trying to start to make sense of that. What are some of the challenges that people who live and work in the area face, perhaps particularly around what it means to live well as individuals and as a community? And then maybe some of the opportunities that those present for the church to engage with people in the community, the people who work here, centered around these ideas of presence, of connection, and of what it means to be a spiritual people. So in brief, that's kind of where I'm coming from, and yeah, what I'd like to talk over tonight. I should say it's very disconcerting. I now can't see you all, so please do interrupt me, and if I need to, because I can't see anybody else now. To start with, what kind of researchers would call the context. What's the background? What's the area? Please do, if you get the opportunity, to look at the full report, which I hope Ian will kind of make available to you. In there are maps, and there are some kind of different pictorial ways for people who are perhaps more visual to start to get a handle on what I think is a really fascinating place. You'll be aware that Christchurch is kind of unusual in a sense, in a church that exists in between other places. Some of the interviewees described it as not really a place, or somewhere a bit betwixt and between. And I think that creates quite an interesting opportunity of that sense of being in between kind of Waterloo, Blackfriars Station, over towards Borough Market, a place in between. And what I did in that section of the report was really just to kind of to start to tease out, so who exists in this place, and how do they relate to that area. So to start with, you've got people who live in the area. Maybe those are people who've lived there for a very long time, maybe they've moved in more recently. But the sense of, you'll be aware, quite a lot of redevelopment and gentrification, but then an area that changes significantly once you get away from the river. And if you just kind of mentally walk in your mind now away from the river, either down Blackfriars Road or through some of the back streets, you can think how that area changes as you move from this area of redevelopment on the river through to the back. And it's interesting, like, that sense of people having very different life experiences. And I think that's something that's going to come up again and again as we talk through some of the findings this evening. Just that sense that one of the interviewees said that many of the real locals aren't actually doing so well. The sense that maybe some people are doing very well and maybe other people are not. So you've got people who live in the area, and you've got people who work in the area, or you did before COVID and people shutting offices. And other people, as I say, described it as much more business orientated, and possibly even raising the question whether, you know, the extent to which people who lived there felt like it was being taken over by people who were working, or businesses moving in. And a sense of a rapidly changing environment for people who are in work. Changing nature of the work and the sorts of businesses and employers in the area, but also continual change within companies. And I think that's something we probably need to be particularly mindful of going forward, that I think if it was an area that was seeing quite a lot of change before, it may be about to see maybe even more change now. And then finally, kind of dividing it up this way, you've got people who are in the area because they're visiting, pointing to the growing number of hotels and the increasing tourist footfall along the river. So when the Church of England talks about the kind of cure of souls in the old-fashioned language, the care for the people who are in the area, we might normally think of that as people who live in the area. But I think in your area in particular, there are lots of different people who make up, and I'm almost hesitant to use the word community, because I'm not sure the extent to which it is one community. Maybe you might want to come back to me on that later. But a number of people who access the local area, the geography, the shops, the restaurants, the cafes, for a whole range of different reasons. Now, of course, as I said earlier, you will all know this differently, and you'll all come at it from your same kind of, from different perspectives. The best way I could come to kind of describe this is perhaps a complex social fabric. I'm not sure how well you can see this page on the screen. Ian, can you read the small text? Yeah, okay. This was just my attempt to kind of to demonstrate in a much more visual way that sense, as one of the interviewees put it, of it shading away from the river. So along the river, you've got high rise, high rent, new developments, hotels, and people who are passing through. But I think, as one of the interviewees said, you know, the tourists only ever go along the river, nobody comes in. And that was certainly her sense, that people moved along, but they didn't necessarily come in. And it was very different back away from the river. And I think it would be a mistake to think about the business community kind of as one kind of amorphous or blank blob, kind of generally wearing suits, and because I think it's not like that. So several people I spoke to who lived and worked in the area for quite a long time were talking about how that, as I said, that business environment was changing. There are some large corporates, but a change maybe from some of the really steady, larger employers that they used to be, to much more of a corporate sector, a bit more like kind of is developing around the Shard. Public sector employers, service and hospitality, a whole range across lots of different sorts of businesses, but you're going to bring in different sorts of people. And then finally, local residents. Both those who've been there for a lot longer, people who've bought. It was amazing when I was talking to people to hear stories who've been there, people who've been there for 40 or 50 years, and the change and the depth of wisdom and experience that people who've been there for a long time have, and the family networks that some of you have. But a sense maybe for some people that some people are left behind as family moved on, and other people who've perhaps moved in not finding it as easy to connect in. And again, I didn't talk to very many people, so it's you always have to kind of hold these things as not being able to be representative of everybody. And other people spoke of a sense of concern almost for some of the newer arrivals. You know, what must it be like to live up there and to have just moved in and to not know anybody? And part of my reason for displaying this like that, I think, is really to encourage you as you start to think as a church community and as a set of church communities about the way forward, to avoid the temptation of overly simplistic social categories or labels, because the reality is much more nuanced. And I think this is a really interesting tension, because one of the things that came through really strongly in talking to people was the need that, as it says here, to reach people, you need to speak their language. You need to speak to them in their terms, on their way. And from that point of view, I think it's helpful to be mindful of the huge range of different sorts of people that you're potentially seeking to speak to. But again, like I say, just being a little bit aware of not oversimplifying that. What do you think, Ian? Do we stop at this point and get people to come back, or shall I plough on?
Oh, yeah. Keep going.
Okay. So that's a little bit, and as I say, there's a huge amount more detail in the report. So hopefully, please don't see this as a done deal tonight. That longer report is something for you to keep going back to and keep referring back to over and over again, because I'm not going to be able to do justice to the detail there. But that's an overview of some of the context, what the local area feels like to people who live there and to work there. And we moved on to talk about some of the challenges that people face. You'll remember that the actual brief for the study overall was to look at the social and the spiritual needs of the people who live and work and visit the local area. Now, the social needs have actually been quite well documented already. There's an excellent report called The Tale of Two Southwarks. And one of the things I was doing was, rather than starting from scratch, when I was having my conversations, I was gently kind of listening for whether the findings of that report kind of chimed with the experience of the people I was talking to. And by and large, it did. So I think in terms of the social needs about things like housing, access to services, employment issues, childcare issues, there's a lot there that you can kind of refer back to and build on. But what that allowed me to do was to really focus in on what we ended up calling the social spiritual needs. What are some of the deeper underlying issues that maybe we all wrestle with in different ways, but maybe the people who are living and working in the area, what are the issues that they're wrestling with? And the first of them really focuses around this idea of social fragmentation and of isolation. That what you've got maybe a little bit more, apologies, I'm hoping that phone will go away as somebody else picks it up, is a set of disparate social groups, people who may never meet. And one of the things, certainly that was my experience as I visited a number of times to come and talk to people, was the more aware I became walking around, that I was seeing different groups of people who actually would probably have no reason to meet and to talk to each other in everyday life. And yet they're existing in the same spaces, walking along the same streets, sometimes even using the same shops and cafes, but might never meet. Other people, particularly those who were working, I spoke to several people who are working in the area to actually provide, using your building to provide classes and that kind of thing. And a common theme that came out from people who got those sort of links with people was that often people signed up to things like yoga or martial arts, that kind of thing, because of a desire to connect, a desire to be part of something. So I think this idea that actually kind of, people are not interested in that anymore doesn't have a huge amount of basis. So people were talking about perhaps particularly people who've moved into the area or who are living elsewhere in London and working in the local area, wanting to connect with people, wanting to build community, and in a sense almost just not knowing where to start. And part of that relates to that second point there about continual change. And I referred to that earlier as almost a characteristic of the area, is the speed of change. And that presents challenges to people. It's unsettling. I think, there was a really lovely quote, I think, which I thought kind of captured this really nicely. Human beings are not necessarily good at dealing with civilization. We haven't been built for it. We're the product of millions of years of evolution and maybe 200 years of social change. And the latter has had a big impact on us. So I think that presents a massive challenge, especially in an area which is built up and very new and with a lot of ongoing change. So that sense of continual change and uncertainty. And again, it's not, I kind of wrote this report and finished it kind of during lockdown, but that sense of uncertainty and not being quite sure what the future holds is only going to be increasing over the next few weeks and months, I would have thought. Lots of people spoke about pressures from work. And one of the really interesting things, I think, is that this spans across social groups. It might be experienced differently by people in different sorts of work, but there were concerns about long hours, tight deadlines, and pressure. Maybe at one end of the job spectrum, job insecurity, possibly right all the way across. People struggling with low pay, having to hold down several jobs. And all of these things limit the amount of time that people perceive they have available for things, for their family, for their well-being, to invest in other stuff. And there were also challenges presented by changing employment practices. I referred to job insecurity, but even flexible working and hot desking and that kind of thing was mentioned by several people as just breaking down maybe the sense of community that people would have got from being part of the same office, part of the same company. And then that final one, mental health and well-being, maybe we're all much more aware of now than we might have been before, but there was a sense that some of the kind of classic things that you might expect from looking at the top of that list, depression, anxiety, substance misuse and suicide, again provide common themes which might be experienced differently by different social groups, but they're almost kind of shared challenges. The way I brought these together was thinking about these as kind of 4 key challenges. social fragmentation, isolation and loneliness, the challenges of dealing with continual change, pressures from work, pressures on mental health and well-being, as kind of almost circling around some deeper, what you might think of as some kind of core issues, which were around meaning and purpose, about connection with others, and about stability and security. Where can I really find myself to be secure? How can I make sense of myself and my meaning and my purpose? How can I connect with others to enable me to do that? And I'm still not sure how to present this. So if any of you are cleverer than me, you might be able to come back with a suggestion. But this diagram down the side was really an attempt, because I started to think about this almost in coming into 3 dimensions. So you've got the 4 key challenges, and you've got all of those different groups down that side of the slide. The people we identified along the river, living and renting hotels, the different sorts of the business community, the different local evidence. And I almost, and again, I can't do this on Zoom, but there's a sense that they interconnect and they cut across. So some of these issues will affect different people in those groups. Some of them affect all of them, maybe in different ways. But actually, they are core themes that affect everybody in different ways. So maybe there's something you can start to kind of gather people around there about saying, well, actually, there are some things that are shared about human experience. So we might present things differently to different groups. We might seek to appeal in different ways to different groups. But some of those core themes are central. So the question is, what opportunities might this present for you as you start to develop your church communities, both those that have been around for a while and newer ones? I'm going to jump to my second point on the slide here, but of course, you know, even the sense of kind of church community might be challenging for quite a lot of people. You know, one of the interviewees said it needs to not look anything like church as they might expect it. Which was partly why I was going out to have these very intentional conversations outside of ordinary church. Because I think sometimes it's easy for those of us who are on the inside to forget just how scary, toxic, forbidding, boring the church looks to people who no longer have very much connection to it. But I think there are opportunities to respond. If we kind of think back to that previous slide, you can kind of sense of all these needs that actually are crying out for the love of God to speak to them and into them, and for people to share the love of God between them and to create opportunities to do that. Several of the people I spoke to talked about being aware of Christchurch's history as an industrial mission. And this sense that, and I'm just going to turn to the right page so I can read you a better quote now. People hear industrial mission and they think of the miners' strike or the printers, the church serving some of the old industries that used to be here. But what does it mean to build on that industrial heritage for a new age? What is the mission? What are our new ways of serving our new communities? And my sense there was that what several people were saying to me is that need for the church to be in and to serve communities might be less obvious than perhaps it was when you'd got very big factories, but actually it's still as pertinent today. There is a little side sense there just to flag up to you that, of course, serving employers is not always the same thing as serving employees. And there's an interesting challenge there in tension about who you get to know and how and why. And several of the people I was talking to kind of pointed out that actually there were opportunities in both directions. Opportunities to serve employees through serving their employers, but also to offer things that actually might go outside of work. In terms of what that reimagining might look like, several people were keen to emphasize how, although people might be turned off by church, that didn't mean that they weren't interested in exploring spiritual things. In the jargon, we kind of call these people spiritual but not religious. So people who are interested in exploring a deeper meaning for life, people who are exploring, sometimes interested in exploring kind of spiritual traditions, mindfulness, meditation, but also kind of a whole breadth across and including Christian spiritualities, but who are just turned off by the idea of institutional church as they know it. Somebody described it as a Marmite term. You either love the church or you hate it. And actually that presents both opportunities and a considerable challenge. Participants recommended using kind of more neutral concepts, not carrying the baggage. But actually, as I say, we're keen to emphasize what the church could still offer. When I tried to unpack what they felt the church could still offer, there was something about those opportunities for a space for connection. And what I mean here is for connection with other people, but also for connection with God. And I think there's a very important sense that actually you can't separate the two. That as we connect with God, we connect with other people. And actually, I think quite a lot of us believe that as we connect with each other, we're starting to connect with what might be seen as the divine. So one phrase that kind of stood out for me was a space that we can create community in. And the building was already described as that. People already felt like they were able to use the building, but that there was the potential for expanding on that, developing and building it. And certainly several people I've spoken to who have been involved with building and with Christchurch for a while were quite excited by those possibilities. What I'm not going to have very much time to talk about this evening is kind of understanding some of the assets that you've got available. And the building and the green space around the building, for all it comes with challenges, for all it comes as, I know some of you are on PCC, headaches around some of the practicalities. But I think it's fair to say that everybody I spoke to also spoke about the positive opportunities presented by the building. And the positive opportunities presented by that little oasis of green space in the middle of what is becoming an increasingly very built up area. So again, that's just to point to you that actually there's a lot more detail in the report that I think you probably need, when you're able to discuss a bit more freely, to come back to and chew over. So like I say, a space that allows people to connect and form community and to be part of something that's bigger than them. And you can start to see here how that connects back to some of those challenges that I identified earlier. A sense that there is something bigger at work than just what we as individuals can do. I should have said, I realised, sorry, that everything in italics on these slides is direct quotes. These are not my words. This is me kind of reflecting the words of other people. And what the building and the space offers is the opportunity for presence. Now, of course, that doesn't have to just be in the building. And I think it would be a mistake to see everybody having to come to the building in order to connect with you. But there's something significant about you can only connect with people if there's something there to connect with. So I kind of, in picking up on different things that people said, I kind of characterize this as somewhere to drop in, but also someone to drop into. Because dropping into an empty building would only take you so far. Dropping in and being able to connect with people. And it's that sense of connection was a strong theme coming through. So in terms of my Whistlestop tour of kind of the sorts of things that people reported back to me and how I kind of tried to make sense of that in something that hopefully you can make sense of, it comes down to this finding new ways of serving not just one new community, but a range of new communities. And a sense of excitement of what that offers, and of challenge and of possibility, in as much as it can feel a bit daunting as well. And the common theme that emerged was this idea of creating and nurturing spaces that allow, and these, I should say, these might be physical spaces, they might be digital spaces, they might be communal spaces that don't always meet in the same place, if that makes sense. So think of space fairly broadly here, but the opportunity for the church to create and to nurture spaces that connect with others, and the other is understood as God. Understood from your perspective, from the Christian tradition and as the Christian God, but actually being quite open in terms of how you present that to other people. Creating and nurturing spaces that allow needs to be identified. One of the, I think one of the astute things that one of the participants said was, many people won't necessarily know what they need. And if you don't know what you need, you won't necessarily be able to go looking for it. But actually they still might be open to having their needs met. It's just a sense of looking to identify them. And I think there's quite a wise warning for a church here, that I think it would be a big mistake to decide what people's needs are and go and tell them about it. Much better to connect with people and to uncover the needs together. And those spaces need to suit different sorts of people in different ways. There is going to be no one size fits all solution. I don't think there is for any church, but there definitely isn't going to be for Christ Church, because of this complex social fabric that you're serving. But key thing being spaces which create places of belonging, that start to meet these needs for meaning, for purpose, for connection, through giving people things to connect to, but also a place to belong. There are 4 recommendations in the report, which kind of, I hope you can see how those lead directly from that kind of central insight. The first is to develop that capacity to connect with and across different communities, acknowledging that Christ Church encompasses many different social groups, seeking to speak to them all in their own language. But of course, that's not going to be something that one person or even one group can do on its own. And when I used that term earlier of a mixed economy or even a mixed ecology, that is in a sense a term that seeks to kind of to sum that up. That actually there is going to be no one size fits all approach. So it needs to be not quite 100 different things for 100 different people, but just different things that seek to reach different groups of people in different ways. And I think there is something there about needing to invest in relationships. You can't speak somebody's language unless you've devoted time both to getting to know them and to practicing the language. And I think there's something quite challenging, but also quite exciting, that the role of the church might be to hold this space that connects with and across different communities. Because actually, I think, you know, if we had a zoom back out to a more national kind of picture at the moment, just briefly, there is this sense that there are different people who might shout at each other in social media terms and have big arguments on Twitter or on Facebook, but don't actually have the opportunity to meet and to form deep and meaningful relationships. And I think there is, I would say, a missional call and imperative to the church to hold those spaces which provide places for people to connect. And like I said, I think you need to recognise that no one person is going to be able to do this on their own. That building a breadth and depth of relationships requires a collective effort, both to support each other and to enable all of you to minister across your different networks in different ways. And the second recommendation is, as you do that, you lean into the breadth and the depth of the Christian tradition. We've talked about church being a kind of Marmite term and putting people off. And I think one of the great sadnesses of that is that there is so much richness there, that the gospel actually is good news and it does have a huge amount to offer people, but we need to find ways almost to translate it into the new ways of new understanding. So it's a question of developing alternative, what might be called kind of culturally appropriate ways of engaging with people. Taking some of the things, whether that's the patterns of the Christian year, whether it's the learning from the Christian mystic and contemplative traditions, whether it's some of the core concepts of forgiveness, reconciliation, relationship, those core themes that come through in the Christian story, and saying, well, okay, what do they mean? What do they mean to somebody who works very long hours servicing the hotels? What do they mean to somebody who is a very long way from home? The third recommendation, going back to that sense of being a space that allows people to connect, is to nurture what one interviewee called a church centre for the community, an ongoing lived presence, which is kind of active and attractive. Because I think there's nothing more off-putting than a church that feels closed, whereas a church that feels open, a church that feels like it's got things going on, is something that's attractive to people who come past. And certainly when I was talking to people who had no connection themselves with the church and with the community, it was really interesting that that was what they were saying they wanted. And yeah, I'm not quite sure how you bridge that gap, but this sense of we want to know that there's somewhere with something going on and tell people about it, which links over to that fourth recommendation, to really invest in presentation and communication. We've talked about finding the right language, but as one interviewee put it, most people share generic human spiritual needs, but if you're not communicating it with them right or effectively, you're never going to meet those needs. It's never going to work. And acknowledging the need for high quality promotion and communication, because people make judgments very quickly. As one of the interviewees put it, we might not want to judge people on first impressions, but we do. People make judgments very quickly, usually based on first impressions of what they can find and of what they see when they get there. And I think that means investing in physical presence. And I've talked about the assets of the building and the garden and the digital presence. And we spent quite some time, particularly in the focus group and in some of my conversations, teasing out that this wasn't a kind of either or, that it needed to be a both and, because things like website and social media are not just the new notice board, they're even more important than the notice board, as one interviewee put it. But on the other hand, another one talked about going past on the bus and noticing whether the lights were on, whether the building looked like it was being used, whether the signs were good, as all being kind of almost subconscious things that affect how people think about it. So the aim of that was just to give you an idea of kind of what was in the report, some of the key themes we looked at. That's the end of the Whistlestop tour, and I think I'm going to hand over to Ian now. If anybody's got any questions or anything, then I'm happy to take those, and then maybe we can have a kind of wider discussion.
I think we've come to the end of our time. Just to say, we will be making reports around. So James, I'll make sure you get a copy of the full report, and I'll make sure everybody here gets a copy of the full report. I know where you work, so that's easy, James, because you're in the building. And anybody else wants a full report, we will do that. And as I said, the whole PCC will get a copy of this now we've had it presented. It's not easy presenting on Zoom, I know, because I've had to do it. I can't say thank you enough to Jane. Talking to a bunch of strangers about stuff you've been wrestling with is never easy, particularly over technology. So Jane, just on behalf of the church, I want to say a big thank you for not only doing the research, but also to present it. It has been an incredibly important first step in us listening to the needs of the area, and something that I know has already galvanized quite a lot of conversations, which will continue. So I can't say thank you to you enough, Jane. So can we just show our appreciation for Jane, if we can, mutedly, but we can stay. So Janet, you can see people are just shaving their hands.
Thank you.
So just to say there'll be more, we will take Jane's, when I long for those days when we actually can meet in the same place and actually exhibit social skills. I quite look forward to us being able to meet to talk about this more in the future when we can. But in the meantime, just to say there will be a Wednesday. We are probably going to use a slot at the, because we have a lot going on Wednesdays anyway, but we're probably going to use a slot on a Wednesday after our meditation group and evening prayer and meditation group. We'll probably use a slot which is free to then do another presentation a bit like this, where we'll present some of the thinking about what we're going to be doing. There's been conversations with the Marshall's charity and with others about next steps. So we will present that next, but we'll come back to you with a update about that later. So a big thank you, everybody, on this Tuesday evening. Anything else you wanted to say, Jane, before we finished?
Yeah, just to echo that. Thank you for your time. I think there's something really exciting here. I grew to love the area, having spent time wandering around it. And I'm fascinated to see kind of where you go from here. And I really hope that it does spark all sorts of different ideas in different directions. But please do keep me in touch with that.